The first sign came on a Tuesday morning. Diane Warren rubbed her tired eyes as she stared at the monitor. For 3 years, she had listened to the empty noise of space at NASA's Deep Space Communications Center. Today was different. "Sir, I'm picking up something," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's structured. Definitely not natural." Her supervisor leaned over her shoulder. "Where's it coming from?" "Just beyond Mars orbit. Signal strength is increasing." She adjusted her headphones and began running the pattern through the translation matrix. Within hours, the entire facility was buzzing with activity. Government officials in dark suits arrived by helicopter. The signal continued, growing stronger and more complex. Diane worked without breaks, feeding the alien language into the computers, searching for patterns. By nightfall, she had translated the first words: prepare, arrival, submission. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Murphy was eating dinner with his daughter when his phone rang. 6 hours later, he stood in an underground bunker beneath the Pentagon, looking at the first images of the Arvani ships. They were massive dark silhouettes against the stars, moving with impossible speed toward Earth. "How many?" he asked the room of military and intelligence officials. "We count 7 capital ships and dozens of smaller vessels," said General Peters. "Each capital ship is approximately 12 miles long." Jack studied the projection. "And their capabilities? Unknown, but their technology is at least several centuries beyond ours." The president's voice came from the large screen on the wall. "Colonel Murphy, I'm putting you on the response team. We need options." "Yes, sir," Jack replied, though he wondered what options they really had. The world changed overnight. News of the approaching aliens leaked despite government efforts at containment. Stock markets crashed. Religious groups proclaimed the end times. People flooded stores for supplies or gathered in churches and squares. 3 days after the first signal, the Arvani entered Earth orbit. Their ships hung in the sky like new moons, visible to the naked eye even in daylight. No weapons were fired. No demands were made beyond the original message, now fully translated. "Prepare for arrival. Submit to processing. Resistance will not be tolerated." An emergency United Nations session was called. Jack sat behind the American delegation, watching representatives from every nation argue about how to respond. Some wanted immediate military action. Others suggested complete surrender. "We don't even know what processing means," the Russian ambassador shouted. The debate ended when the center of the chamber filled with light. A holographic figure appeared, tall, with smooth gray skin and 4 arms. Its face had no nose, just breathing slits and 6 eyes arranged in a circle. "People of Earth," it spoke in perfect English. "I am Commander Zex of the Arvani Collective. Your world has been selected for processing. Your resources and biological material will serve the collective. Resistance is futile and illogical given our technological superiority." The chamber fell silent. "You have 24 hours to deliver your unconditional surrender. After that, processing begins regardless of your decision. The only variable is the survival rate of your species." A hologram vanished. Panic erupted in the chamber. Later that night, Jack was reviewing intercepted Arvani communications when Diane Warren knocked on his office door. "Colonel Murphy, I found something in their transmission patterns." She placed a tablet on his desk. "There are inconsistencies, encrypted channels. I think they're arguing among themselves." Jack studied the data. "They're not as unified as they want us to believe." He looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the massive ships above. Everything said humanity should surrender. The odds were impossible, but something in those communications gave him hope. The next morning, Jack stood before the Security Council. "I recommend we reject their terms," he said firmly. "Based on what?" demanded the Chinese representative. "Based on the fact that throughout human history, surrender has never saved us from tyrants," Jack replied. "And I believe these aliens have weaknesses they're trying to hide." The vote was not unanimous, but Earth's answer was delivered within the hour. Humanity would not surrender. The Arvani ships moved into position over major cities across the globe within hours of humanity's refusal. They hung in the sky like giant metal clouds, blocking the sun in some places. People watched from below with fear and wonder. In New York, giant screens on buildings showed the same message. Processing begins. Surrender for survival consideration. Dr. Alan Peters was not watching the sky. He was in his basement lab at MIT, studying the Arvani signal patterns that NASA had shared with scientists worldwide. Something about their communications technology seemed familiar to him. The wave patterns, he muttered to himself, adjusting his glasses. They're sensitive to harmonic disruption. He typed furiously, running simulations. His computer showed that a specific frequency caused interference patterns in the Arvani signals. It was like finding a hole in a fence. Small, but possibly useful. Meanwhile, in a bar outside Fort Bragg, Chris Harper nursed a beer while watching the news. The former Navy SEAL had been called back to active duty, but was still waiting for orders. 3 other soldiers joined him at his table. "What do you think, Harper?" asked one. "Are we all dead?" Chris shook his head. "Not yet. Those things up there, they're advanced, but they're still just machines and creatures. Everything that exists can be broken." His phone buzzed with a message. Operation Firewall. Report to Cheyenne Mountain Complex. At NASA, Diane Warren worked with a team of engineers led by Susan Miller. Susan had been developing satellite technology before the invasion. Now she focused on creating devices that might interfere with Arvani systems. "If we can disrupt their communications," Susan explained, holding up a small prototype, "we might buy ourselves some time." Diane nodded, passing her the signal data. "Their language has patterns. I think I can predict their movements if we can tap into their network." The first Arvani landing ships descended on Chicago. They came without warning, massive craft settling in parks and wide avenues. Doors opened, and tall gray figures emerged, carrying strange devices. People who tried to run were frozen in place. Those who surrendered were herded into lines. The processing had begun. Buildings were systematically taken apart, materials sorted and stored. People were scanned, some taken aboard ships, others left standing in holding fields. Similar scenes played out in Beijing, London, and Cairo. Earth's military forces launched attacks, jets, missiles, tanks, but their weapons barely scratched the Arvani ships. The counterattacks were swift and devastating. Entire military bases vanished in flashes of blue light. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colonel Jack Murphy briefed the assembled team. The facility, designed to survive nuclear war, was now humanity's hidden command center. "We have 3 objectives," Jack said, pointing to the map showing Arvani positions worldwide. "First, understand their technology. Second, develop countermeasures. Third, coordinate global resistance." Chris Harper stood with his newly formed Special Forces team. They were an unusual mix: soldiers, hackers, scientists, and spies from a dozen countries. Dr. Alan Peters showed his frequency discovery. "It's not a weapon, but it might help us spy on them." Susan Miller added, "We can build devices to broadcast this frequency. Small ones, easy to hide." Diane Warren brought up intercepted communications on the screen. "I've been analyzing their patterns. The Arvani aren't just conquerors. They're harvesters. They've done this before, many times." She showed images reconstructed from Arvani data, planets stripped of resources, civilizations reduced to work camps. "How many worlds?" Jack asked quietly. "Thousands," Diane replied. "They move through the galaxy like locusts. But here's the important part. They have a schedule. They never stay more than 3 Earth months on any planet. They take what they want and move on." Chris studied the images. "Then we need to make those 3 months hell for them." Jack nodded. "We call this Operation Firewall. We won't win with direct confrontation. We need to be smarter." He looked at the determined faces around him. They expect us to either surrender or die fighting. They don't expect us to resist intelligently. That's our advantage. Outside, an Arvani ship passed overhead, unaware of the facility buried deep in the mountain. Inside, humanity prepared its response. Surrender was never an option. 2 weeks after the invasion began, Chris Harper and his team crouched in the woods outside Denver. The city had been one of the first to be processed. Now it was a hub for Arvani ground operations. Their target was a small scout ship that landed each night in the same clearing to collect data. "Remember," Chris whispered to his team of 6, "we need that ship intact. No explosives unless absolutely necessary." They wore dark clothes and carried Susan's disruptor devices, small boxes that emitted the frequency Alan had discovered. Their faces were painted black, eyes focused. "Start the countdown," Chris ordered. A mile away, another team activated a larger disruptor. Within seconds, the Arvani guards near the scout ship began moving erratically. Their communications disrupted. "Now," Chris said. They moved swiftly through the darkness. 2 Arvani guards turned too late as tranquilizer darts, designed based on captured Arvani biological data, hit their gray skin. The aliens collapsed. The team reached the ship, a sleek craft about the size of a bus. Its surface shimmered with an odd metallic glow. 15 minutes until their systems adapt, warned Lisa, the team's tech specialist. Inside the ship, they faced resistance. An Arvani pilot fired a weapon that shot blue energy. It hit Miguel, turning him instantly to ash. Chris returned fire with his rifle, modified with special ammunition. The Arvani fell. "Download everything," Chris ordered, as Lisa connected to the ship's computer system. Carl, a German Special Forces soldier, examined the ship's controls. "I think I can fly this." Outside, alarms began to sound. The main Arvani ship had detected the disruption. "We need to go," Chris said. 10 minutes until extraction. Suddenly, 3 more Arvani appeared at the entrance. Paul, the team's demolition expert, was hit in the leg by an energy blast. The limb disintegrated. "Get him aboard," Chris shouted, providing cover fire. As the remaining team dragged the wounded man inside, Chris felt a burning sensation across his back. An energy blast had grazed him. He fell forward into the ship. "Close it," he gasped. The door sealed. Carl activated the controls, and the scout ship lurched upward. Energy blasts from ground troops lit up the night around them. The ship shuddered, but held together. "We got it," Lisa said, looking up from her device. "I downloaded their local network data." Carl navigated through the night sky, using the disruptor to confuse Arvani tracking systems. By dawn, they had landed at a hidden facility in the Rocky Mountains. Inside the Cheyenne Mountain complex, Alan and Susan immediately began examining the captured ship. The wounded were taken to the medical bay, where Paul died despite efforts to save him. Miguel's family was notified of his sacrifice. Chris, his back bandaged, gave his report to Jack Murphy. "2 dead, but we got the ship and their local network data," he said grimly. Jack nodded. "Those men didn't die for nothing. This is our first real victory." Diane worked with Lisa to decode the downloaded information. Within hours, they made a breakthrough. "Look at this," Diane said, pointing to her screen where a map of stars appeared. "These are their harvest records. Dates, resource yields, resistance levels. So many worlds," Jack whispered, looking at the thousands of points of light. "And here's their timeline for Earth," Diane continued. "They plan to be done in less than 60 days now." Meanwhile, Susan and Alan made progress with the captured technology. Susan emerged from the lab holding a modified version of her disruptor. "We've improved it," she announced to the gathered leaders. "This version can disable their smaller ships completely for about 5 minutes. It has triple the range of our original design." "Can we mass produce it?" Jack asked. Susan nodded. "With the manufacturing cells we've set up in hidden locations, we can make hundreds within a week." "Good," Jack said. Because it's time we take this fight global. Using encrypted channels, they contacted resistance groups that had formed in other parts of the world. Everyone received the plans for Susan's improved disruptor. In orbit, the Arvani commander received reports of the stolen scout ship. It was a small loss, but troubling. Humans were not behaving as expected. Most species surrendered after the first demonstrations of Arvani power. Accelerate the processing schedule, the commander ordered, and double the ground forces in all major collection points. Back on Earth, resistance fighters prepared for their first coordinated attack. Surrender was still not an option. 1 month after the invasion, resistance cells struck simultaneously around the world. In Paris, fighters disabled an Arvani processing center. In Tokyo, they destroyed 3 landing craft. In Rio, they freed thousands of captured humans from holding fields. The Arvani responded with fury. From orbit, they launched energy strikes against suspected resistance bases. Entire small towns vanished in blue flashes of light. But the resistance had expected this. Most bases were empty decoys. At the Cheyenne Mountain complex, Jack watched the global reports with mixed feelings. They had hurt the Arvani for the first time, but at a terrible cost. Casualties? He asked softly. Over 400 resistance fighters lost, said Diane, looking at her tablet. But we've slowed their processing by nearly 20%. The victory felt hollow as Jack thought of the faces of those who wouldn't return. Then his screen beeped with an incoming message. His face went pale. They've put a containment field over Kansas City, he said, his voice tight. My wife and daughter are there. Susan placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll find a way to help them. Jack, we're making progress. She wasn't exaggerating. The improved disruptor technology had been distributed worldwide. Small resistance units now had the ability to temporarily disable Arvani systems. Alan burst into the command center, his eyes wild with excitement. You need to come to the lab right now, he said. They followed him to a secure room where an Arvani sat in a transparent cell. It had been captured during the Paris operation. Its 6 eyes moved constantly, watching them. It speaks English, Alan explained, and it wants to talk. The Arvani's voice was oddly musical. Your resistance is stronger than expected, it said. The commander did not account for your adaptability. Why are you telling us this? Jack asked suspiciously. Because there is discord among the collective, the alien replied. Some believe this harvest breaks the ancient treaty. What treaty? Diane asked. With the Guardians, the beings who protect developing worlds. The Arvani's breathing slits widened. Your world should have been protected. There are signs it was marked by them. Jack leaned closer to the cell. Who are these Guardians? Ancient, powerful. The only force the collective fears. The Arvani seem to shudder. They enforce balance in the galaxy, but they have not been seen in many cycles. The commander believes they are gone. Later, Diane worked late into the night, searching through the data from the captured scout ship. The Arvani's words about Guardians had sparked something in her memory. There, she whispered, finding an encrypted file. Coordinates. She plotted them on a star chart. They pointed to a location far beyond Pluto, at the edge of the solar system. The next morning, as she prepared to share her discovery, alarms blared throughout the complex. The Arvani had adapted to the disruptor technology faster than expected. Their ships now carried shields that blocked the frequency. Reports came in from around the world. Resistance bases were being discovered and destroyed. The tide was turning back in the Arvani's favor. In the command center, Jack gathered the core team. We need something new, he said firmly. The disruptors won't work for much longer. Susan nodded grimly. I've been working on a more powerful version. It would require direct placement on their main reactor systems, but it could disable an entire capital ship. That would mean getting aboard their command ship, Chris said, his healed wounds still visible as scars on his face. A suicide mission. Maybe not, Alan interjected. I've been studying their biology. The Arvani have a hierarchical hive mind. They're connected, but it flows from the top down. Jack looked at him sharply. You mean if we take out their leadership, we could disrupt the entire collective on Earth? Alan finished. As they discussed the possibilities, a message came in from Kansas City. Somehow, Jack's wife had managed to send a transmission from inside the containment field. The video showed thousands of people in massive holding pens. Arvani moved among them, selecting some for transport to the ships, leaving others behind. Jack's daughter appeared briefly on screen, her face thin but determined. We're still fighting, his wife's voice said before the transmission cut out. Jack turned to the others, his face set in stone. We're going after their command ship, not just to disable it, but to find their weakness and end this. Outside, the Arvani continued their harvest, unaware that humanity was preparing its most desperate gambit. The plan was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but they had run out of options. Jack stood before the assembled team in the deepest room of the mountain complex, explaining the mission. We need to get aboard the Arvani command ship, he said, pointing to images of the massive vessel that hung over what was once New York City. Susan has developed a new disruptor that could disable their main systems, but it must be placed directly on their central reactor. Susan held up a device the size of a backpack. It looked heavier than the previous models. This contains enough power to overload their entire network, she explained. But someone needs to set it up manually and activate it on site. Chris stepped forward. I'll lead the insertion team. I'm going to, Jack said firmly. This isn't just about the mission anymore. It's personal. No one argued. They had all lost someone to the Arvani. Alan showed them detailed schematics of the command ship, pieced together from the captured data. Their central reactor is here, he said, pointing to the core of the ship. But their security will be heaviest in that area. How do we even get aboard? Asked Lisa, who had recovered from the scout ship mission. We use their own shuttle, Chris replied. The one we captured has been modified with our technology. It should get us past their outer defenses. Preparations moved quickly. They had less than 2 weeks before the Arvani would finish processing the eastern United States and move their command ship. 20 soldiers and scientists volunteered for the mission. Only 12 would go. Meanwhile, Diane continued studying the coordinates she had found. I think these point to some kind of outpost, she told Jack privately. But it would take years to reach with our current technology. If we succeed, we might get access to their faster ships, Jack replied. Keep working on it. It could be our backup plan. The night before the mission, Jack recorded messages for his wife and daughter, in case he didn't return. Chris found him later, staring at a photo of his family. We're going to make it back, Chris said, sitting beside him. Jack nodded. And if we don't, we'll make sure it counts. The next morning, the team gathered at a hidden airfield in the mountains. The modified Arvani shuttle waited, its strange metal skin reflecting the sunrise. As they prepared to board, Alan made a discovery that changed everything. The Arvani network is more complex than we thought, he explained urgently. They don't just communicate, they're mentally linked. It's a true hive mind, with the Supreme Commander at the center. What does that mean for us? Jack asked. It means if we can access their network directly, we might be able to do more than just disable their ship, Alan replied. We could disrupt their entire collective consciousness. Susan quickly modified her plan. I can rewire the disruptor to send a pulse through their network, but we'd need direct access to their main computer core. Jack looked at the schematics again. That's right next to the Supreme Commander's chamber. The mission had just become even more dangerous, but potentially more rewarding. To draw attention away from the real mission, resistance forces worldwide launched simultaneous attacks on Arvani ground operations. The skies lit up with energy weapons and explosions as the shuttle lifted off. Chris piloted the craft while Lisa handled communications. They used the captured Arvani codes to approach the command ship, hearts pounding as they awaited either clearance or destruction. Shuttle TR-419 requesting docking access for maintenance cycle. Lisa transmitted in the Arvani language. There was a long pause. Jack held his breath. "Clearance granted," came the reply. "Proceed to Bay 7. Relief washed over the team, but they knew the hardest part was still ahead. The shuttle entered the massive ship through an opening in its side. Inside was a cavernous docking bay filled with similar craft and patrolled by Arvani guards. "Remember," Jack whispered as they prepared to disembark, "our primary objective is placing Susan's device. Everything else is secondary." Diane's voice came through their earpieces from the mountain base. "I've hacked into their internal communications. You have approximately 30 minutes before the next security sweep." The team moved out, wearing stolen Arvani worker garments over their combat gear. The inside of the command ship was vast, with corridors stretching in all directions. Strange lights pulsed along the walls, and the air smelled faintly metallic. As they moved deeper into the ship, Jack couldn't help but wonder, were they about to save humanity, or had they just walked into a trap? The team moved through the massive ship like shadows. They passed strange rooms where Arvani worked at glowing control panels. The disguises helped them avoid immediate detection, but they couldn't speak the language if questioned. Left at the next junction, Ellen's voice guided them through their earpieces. He was monitoring their progress using the ship schematics. The central core should be 2 levels down. They found an elevator-like tube that moved in all directions. Jack looked at Chris, who nodded. The team stepped inside. "Down 2 levels," Chris whispered to the control panel in English. Surprisingly, the tube responded, moving smoothly downward. The Arvani had programmed their systems to understand human languages. When the doors opened, they faced their first real challenge. 4 armed Arvani guards stood at a checkpoint, blocking access to the ship's central sections. Lisa stepped forward with a small device in her palm. It emitted a quick pulse that made the Arvani freeze momentarily, just long enough for the team to take them down with tranquilizer weapons. "Hurry," Jack urged as they dragged the unconscious aliens aside. "Their absence will be noticed soon." Beyond the checkpoint, the corridors became wider and more ornate. The lighting changed from harsh white to a soft purple glow. They were entering the command section of the ship. Diane's voice came through urgently in their ears. "Multiple life signs ahead. It looks like some kind of gathering." Jack signaled the team to halt. He and Chris carefully approached a large doorway, peering around the edge. Inside was a vast chamber filled with dozens of Arvani. They stood in concentric circles around a central platform, where a larger Arvani with distinctive red markings addressed them. "That must be the Supreme Commander," Jack whispered. Chris nodded. "And that," he pointed to a glowing column behind the platform, "must be their network core." They retreated to inform the team. Susan studied the layout. "The reactor is 1 level below this chamber," she said. "We need to split up. One team places the disruptor on the reactor. The other accesses the network core." "I'll lead the reactor team," Chris volunteered. "I'll take the network," Jack said. "Susan, you're with me. We'll need your expertise." The team divided their equipment and separated. Chris led his group toward another tube that would take them to the reactor level. Jack's team remained, looking for another way into the chamber. They found a maintenance access panel. One by one, they squeezed through into a narrow service corridor that ran behind the walls of the main chamber. Through small gaps, they could see the Arvani assembly continuing. "What are they saying?" Jack asked, wishing Diane were there to translate. As if hearing his thoughts, Diane's voice came through their earpieces. "I'm picking up their broadcast. They're discussing humans. Specifically, they're studying our emotions. The Supreme Commander is saying our emotional responses make us unpredictable." Jack looked at Susan. "This might be important information." Meanwhile, Chris's team reached the reactor level. It was surprisingly unguarded. "They don't expect anyone to get this far," Lisa observed as they approached the massive glowing core that powered the entire ship. As Susan had instructed, they began attaching the disruptor device to a control panel. The technology was alien, but Susan's instructions were clear. Connection established, one of the team reported. Waiting for activation signal. Back in the service corridor, Jack's team found what they were looking for. An access point to the network core. Susan quickly connected her equipment. I can interface with their system, she whispered excitedly. And I'm downloading everything. Their complete database. Jack nodded. Send it to Diane. Even if we don't make it, that information could save Earth. As Susan worked, Jack noticed something through one of the gaps in the wall. Off to the side of the main chamber was another room, visible through a transparent wall. Inside were rows of clear pods, each containing a human. They're alive, he gasped. They're studying them. The humans in the pods were connected to machines that monitored their vital signs. Some seemed to be in a dream state, their eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids. Jack was about to speak when a voice filled the service corridor. It wasn't coming through their earpieces. It was all around them. Humans, the voice said in perfect English. Your presence is known. Your mission is understood. Panel doors slid open at both ends of the corridor. Arveni guards appeared, weapons aimed at Jack's team. In the main chamber, the Supreme Commander turned toward their hiding place, all 6 of its eyes focused in their direction. I have been expecting you, it said. The Supreme Commander approached Jack's team, its tall figure looming over them. The other Arvani formed a circle, cutting off any escape. Your species continues to surprise us, the Supreme Commander said. No other world has mounted such resistance. Most accept their fate. Jack stood tall. Humans don't surrender easily. So we have observed. The Supreme Commander gestured to the pods containing humans. Your emotional responses are fascinating. Unlike any species we have processed before. Jack noticed Susan still working behind her back, finalizing the data transfer to Diane. He needed to buy time. Why are you doing this? He asked. There must be uninhabited worlds with resources. Biological material is as valuable as minerals. The Supreme Commander replied. Particularly unusual specimens like yourselves. Through his earpiece, Jack heard Chris whisper, disruptor in place, awaiting your signal. The Supreme Commander tilted its head. Your companions at the reactor will not succeed. The device has already been detected. Susan stepped forward suddenly. Maybe not, but this will work. She pressed a button on her device. Nothing happened. The Supreme Commander made a sound like laughter. Your technology is primitive. Maybe, Susan said with a smile, but it was enough to distract you. At that moment, her real device, hidden in her pocket, activated. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber. The Arvani nearest to Susan clutched their heads in pain. The networked connection that linked them was being overloaded. Now, Chris, Jack shouted into his comm. On the reactor level, Chris activated the disruptor. The ship's lights flickered. Power surged and failed throughout the vessel. The Supreme Commander staggered but remained standing. This changes nothing. The collective will continue. Not if we sever the connection, Susan said, tapping more commands into her device. The Supreme Commander lunged toward her. Jack jumped between them, but was thrown aside. The alien grabbed Susan by the throat, lifting her off the ground. You will fail, it hissed. I don't think so, Susan gasped. She pressed one final button before the Supreme Commander snapped her neck. Jack screamed as Susan's body fell to the floor. The device she had activated rolled toward him. Its screen showed a countdown. 30 seconds. Everyone out, he shouted to the remaining team members. Get back to the shuttle. As they ran, Jack grabbed Susan's primary device, the one still connected to the network core. It contained the complete download of the Arvani database. Throughout the ship, systems failed. Arvani crew members moved erratically, their connection to the hive mind disrupted. The team fought their way back toward the docking bay, facing less resistance than expected. Jack contacted Chris. Get your team out. Susan's device is about to overload their entire system. Already moving, Chris replied. Most of my team is at the shuttle. But Jack, we can't wait long. Jack fought through a group of confused Arvani guards. He was the last of his team still in the command section. The others had made it to the elevators. He turned a corner and came face to face with the Supreme Commander. "You," the alien growled, apparently able to function independently despite the network disruption. "Me," Jack replied, holding up Susan's device. "You know what this contains? Everything. Your entire database, your weaknesses, your future plans. It will die with you," the Supreme Commander said, advancing. Jack smiled grimly. "It's already been transmitted. Humanity knows how to hurt you now." Behind the Supreme Commander, Susan's overload device reached zero. A massive energy pulse surged through the ship. Jack was thrown backward by the force. The Supreme Commander screamed as the pulse tore through its body. The hive mind connection that gave it power became its weakness, channeling the destructive energy directly into its brain. Jack crawled away as secondary explosions rocked the ship. He found an emergency pod, similar to the ones used to study humans, but designed for escape. As he sealed himself inside, he saw the Supreme Commander's body dissolve into energy. The pulse was spreading throughout the ship, following the network connections to every Arvani vessel in Earth orbit. The pod ejected into space just as the command ship began to break apart. Through the small window, Jack watched as the massive vessel collapsed. Other Arvani ships across the sky flickered and went dark. The pod's communication system still worked. Jack connected to the resistance frequency. "Mission accomplished," he said weakly, his injuries finally catching up to him. Susan gave her life, but we got their database. We know how to beat them now." Diane's voice came through, filled with emotion. "The Arvani fleet is disabled worldwide. Jack, you did it."